It's been a little over a century since the events of today's story took place. This unsolved mystery still haunts the people of Kaifeck, Bavaria, a town about 51 miles or 82.08 kilometers from the Bavarian capital city of Munich to this day. 6 people were found dead in the homestead of the Gruber family. That home was called Hinterkaifeck, and it was located in the town of Gruber, just on the outskirts of Kaifeck. I have pulled a lot of detail from the sources. Many of these sources I found had to be translated out of German, so if I get anything wrong, be sure to let me know in the comments below. Their family was comprised of Andreas, the patriarch, Kazilla, the matriarch, Victoria Gabrielle, their daughter, and her 2 children, little Kazilia and Joseph. Also living with the family was their new housekeeper, Maria Baumgartner, who had showed up that afternoon. Today's video will cover the murders, the suspects, and the potential reasons why the family was killed. Stay tuned for answers. Real quick, thanks for checking in here at Creepycassettiyt. I'm Dee, and if you want more stories of the strange, mysterious, or just plain creepy, click the like, subscribe, and notification bell. If you have any suggestions for our next topic, please let me know in the comments below. I appreciate you. Now back to the story. Before the murder. When Maria Baumgartner's sister dropped her off at the homestead of the Gruber family on March 31st, 1922, she couldn't have known that would be the last time she would ever see Maria. She also couldn't have known she may have been a potential 7th victim of the massacre. She just knew she was walking her sister to her new place of employment, and she probably thought she'd be seeing her again on a day off. Sure, she might have heard the stories passed around by the family's prior housekeeper, Rders. The old woman hadn't hidden her experiences and fear of the place. She felt the place was haunted, having often heard footsteps in the attic when she knew for a fact the house's residents were fast asleep. If it wasn't the tip-tapping of footsteps, it was the disembodied voices. She'd worked from the family from November 1920, but in September 1921, she'd had enough of all the inexplicable goings-on, and she quit. Rders wasn't the only one having eerie experiences around the house. All the family members noticed keys would randomly go missing. Andreas found a newspaper from Munich that no one in the house was subscribed to, which, if we're talking geography here, this place was a legitimate piece of farmland. The nearest neighbor was not close enough to drop their newspaper. Even little Kazilia was starting to struggle in school. She would keep falling asleep in class, stating that her mother was keeping her up much of the night. One night, a little bit before the murders occurred, some familial discourse took place, causing Victoria to have an outburst. She ran into the forest, sat behind a tree, just bawling. Little Kazilia was the one to find her and eventually coax her back into the home. Andreas found a set of footprints in the snow leading from the forest behind the house into the machine room, a forest whose name eerily translates to witch's wood, called Hexenholz. But he did not find any footsteps leading away from the machine room, giving the impression that whoever had gone in had never come back out. Andreas must have been a bit uncomfortable with the implications because he traveled around to visit the neighbors. He wanted to know if they noticed anything suspicious. The resounding response from the few neighbors he briefly interviewed said they hadn't noticed anything on their own farms. When asked about the newspaper he found on his property, it turns out none of the neighbors subscribed to the paper either. So it wasn't like the postman accidentally dropped the newspaper off, so the question of how it got there remained unanswered. The family had gone without a housekeeper for 6 months. Maria was the long-awaited replacement. That evening she started settling into her new surroundings, learning how the family preferred things done, taking on a task or two, and getting a feel for the Gruber family dynamics. Andreas Gruber, aged 63, Casilla Gruber, 72, were the parents of Victoria Gabrielle, who was 35, and grandparents to Victoria's 2 children, a daughter also named Kazilia, 7, and son Joseph. The night of the murders. On the night of the murders, one source states that the killer lured some of the family members into the bar. It's not clear how they were lured. The family had gone to investigate the animals making sounds of alarm inside the barn. One by one, 4 members of the Gruber family stormed in. One by one, they were slaughtered. Andreas had his face smashed in forcefully, and a gaping hole was left exposing his cheekbone. Grandma Cazelia was strangled and her head was struck 8 times, causing her skull to crack and cave. Victoria was strangled, 9 star-shaped holes left on the right side of her face. The elder Cazelia and Victoria were the only 2 victims who were strangled. Lastly, poor little Cazelia's skull was smashed, her neck gashed with a pocket knife, and her mouth covered with an iron band. Terribly, the little girl was alive for quite some time after the attack. She was found with clumps of her own hair in her hand as if she had been trying to pull away her pain. The killer stacked the bodies one on top of the other and covered them all in hay. Beneath the hay, the killer buried the pocket knife and iron band. None of the 3 weapons used during the attack would be found until much later. Then the killer made his way into the main house. There he thrashed Maria with a tool shaped much like a pickaxe. Then he went for little Joseph and he just smashed the babe's face in while he was in his bassinet. It would take 4 whole days before the bodies would be found. A day after the murder, 2 brothers, Edward and Hans Sharovsky, came by to take coffee order for the family. When no one came to greet them, they looked around the farm, but they didn't go into any of the outbuildings or the family home. They did take note that the gate to the machine room was open, but after their little investigation, they just left. The farm was quiet for a few days, but smoke was still billowing from the chimney, which left the impression to the neighbors that passed by that the family was just fine. But this was a time long before social media, which meant people actually had to get outside of their homes and interact with others for their entertainment. But none of the neighbors had seen the family in a couple of days. Cazelia's teacher took notice that the little girl had not been in school, nor had the teacher been notified of the reason for her absence from the girl's caregivers, which was unlike them. The family were also very devout Christians and went noticeably missing from church on Sunday, which obviously caused some concern. By April 4th, 1922, the postman noticed the family's mail piling up. Albert Hoffner came by the farm to repair the food chopper machine. He worked for hours, but because he could hear the animals and the dog inside the barn, he figured that the family had just stepped out for a while. He left out having spoken to anyone, but he otherwise didn't notice anything off. The discovery. A few hours later, Lorenz Schlittenbauer sent his sons over to the Gruber farm to check on the neighbors. The sons reported to their father they hadn't found anything, so Lorenz gathered a couple of other neighbors, Michael Paul and Jacob Sigel, and 3 of them broke into the farm gates. First, they found the 4 in the barn. Then Lorenz, who mentioned he had a key to the farmhouse, let the 3 of them in, and they found Maria in her bedchamber and Joseph in the bassinet. Does anyone else find it a bit suspicious that Lorenz had a key to the house? How close was he with the family that he had a key to their safe space? The crime scene was not properly secured. People who entered the homestead moved items and bodies around, which hampered the initial investigation. On top of that, the killer had made themselves comfortable. They spent the 4 days following the murders feeding and watering the animals and cooking meals for themselves. The bodies were autopsied in the barn, and it was discovered that the murder weapon was a mattock. A mattock is a tool, much like a pickaxe, that is used to dig, pry, or chop. But the weapon was not found upon initial investigation. It would not be found until 1 year later, when the farmstead was being demolished. The mattock was found in the attic, and then the iron bands and the pocket knife were found in the hay during demolition. Authorities initially thought the murders were the result of a robbery gone wrong. Police investigated traveling craftsmen, unhoused individuals, and inhabitants from the neighboring areas. However, when a large sum of money was found in the house, that theory was dropped. There were a number of suspect theories. Some resources mentioning there have been at least 100 suspects in the 100 years since the Gruber family's demise. But let's just talk about 3 of them. One that I found interesting, albeit unlikely, and 2 that seemed very likely. One suspect, and probably the strangest of the conspiracies, was Carl Gabriel, Victoria's supposedly deceased spouse. You see, although the family was informed that Carl Gabriel died from a shell attack December 1914 in Rders, France during World War I, no body was found. Some prisoners of war who were prematurely released from their captivity in Schrobenhausen stated that they had been released by a German French-speaking Soviet officer who admitted to being the Hinterkaifeck murderer. Those same ex-prisoners later changed their statement, losing credibility, and while this is the most unlikely one, it's an interesting theory. Then there was the Bichler brothers, Anton and Carl. Anton had worked as a farmhand during a potato harvest at Hinterkaifeck and had a good lay of the land. He must not have parted on good terms with the family because he had once implied to Crescents, remember the first housekeeper, that the family ought to be dead. The family dog was familiar enough with Anton not to bark when the man came around. Crescents also mentioned that a stranger would come to her window and talk to her at night, and she later suspected it was Anton Bichler. It was Crescents that mentioned the Bichler brothers and George Siegel as the potential suspects. George Siegel also worked on the farm for a time and was very aware of the family's good fortune. In November 1920, Siegel allegedly broke into the house and stole a number of items but denied it every time he was asked about the robbery. Siegel also carved the handle of the medic used during the murder, and he knew where it was kept. But let's talk about history's main suspect, the one that all the sources place as having the most motive to kill. Remember, Lorenz had a key to the house? Strike one. Strike two, Lorenz was a farmer himself, so he was familiar with animal care. Remember how we talked about the animals being fed and watered in the days following the murders? Strike three, he was familiar with the farm's layout, being a close neighbor and having carried on a years-long affair with Victoria. He also suspiciously mentioned once upon interview with the police that the killer did not bury the bodies because the ground was frozen. Keen observation, sure, but I wouldn't be making any best guesses of this type to the authorities. But the final strike, the coup de grace, if you will, Lorenz had motive, big time. He was court-ordered to pay child support for Joseph due to the affair between him and Victoria. But remember how earlier I said Joseph was thought to be Andrea's child? It's not as far-fetched as one might think, since the two were convicted of having an incestuous relationship in 1915, and Andreas actually did some time for this. Lorenz was probably double angry for having to pay for a child that may or may not be his. His thought process may have been no child, no child support. Doesn't really explain killing the whole family, but could have been a way to erase witnesses and make it easier to get to the child. It makes sense since the elder family members would do what they could do to protect Joseph. Many of the locals consider Lorenz to be the most likely subject, and as a result, his reputation was tarnished. The story of the Hinterkaifeck murders caused a media firestorm. It was one of the most brutal crimes to take place in Bavaria. Numerous publications picked up the story and implied or outright accused Lorenz of being the murderer, but he wasn't going to take such damaging speculations sitting down. He did not shy away from litigation whenever his name was dragged in to the story of the murders. He brought to trial case after case until his passing in 1941. Conclusion? I'm going to totally butcher this word, but let's give it a go. Furstenfeldbruck Police Academy picked the case back up in 2007. While they could not come up with a formal conclusion due to missing evidence, the age of the evidence remaining, and the deaths of some of the suspects, they did agree on a final theory as to who the murderer was. However, they have chosen not to release the name of the suspect killer. We will probably never know who killed the Grubers and Maria Baumgartner. People familiar with this case will have their own ideas of who was responsible, but innocent until proven guilty, right? That's all I have for you today. I know the story was terribly dark, but I hope the rest of your day is full of light. Don't forget to subscribe and join me for more. Take care.